Last time, we discussed politics and World War I Prime Minister Robert Borden's contribution to Canada's history. This time, let's look at a man who's a doctor, a saint, and a hero. He changed Chinese, Spanish, and Canadian societies alike. Heck, he changed the world. Introducing Dr. Norman Bethune. Norman Bethune was born on the 3rd of March, 1890, at Gravenhurst, Ontario, as the son of a clergyman. However, Norman, with his talent and ambitions, took on his grandfather's career of a surgeon. Until 1911, he studied at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Medicine, for which he then began to work for Frontier College as a laborer teacher. 1914 saw the outbreak of the First World War. Disturbed by the described atrocities occurring in France, he decided that he needed to contribute. At age 24, Norman sailed to France with the No. 2 Field Ambulance Medical Corps a year later in the February of 1915. He served as a stretcher bearer in Ypres, Belgium, until the shrapnel from an exploded shell injured one of his legs, upon which Norman then sailed to Britain and spent 3 months in a hospital. After recovery, Bethune began studying again in Canada and earned a Bachelor of Medicine at age 26 in December 1916. Interestingly, one of his friends and classmates, Frederick Banting, became the co-discoverer of insulin. Compelled to return to the war in Europe, Bethune became a lieutenant surgeon in the British Navy. Following the war, Norman applied for an internship at the prestigious Hospital for Sick Children in London and stayed for 6 months. He returned once again to Canada to work privately in Stratford, Ontario. Afterwards, he headed back to Britain and trained at the University of Edinburgh as a surgeon, and was elected a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in February 1922 for his exceptional medical talent. It was then that Bethune began to face a series of difficulties in his personal life. He married a Scottish girl named Frances Campbell Penny and moved together to Detroit, only to separate 4 years later in 1926 due to his flamboyant and expensive lifestyle. In the same year, he was diagnosed with pulmonary tuberculosis. However, it might have been because of these challenges that Norman Bethune began to really become an exceptionally important figure. In a New York sanitarium, he began to realize how hopeless tuberculosis victims could be. After a surprising recovery, Bethune went to the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal in September 1928 to devote himself for 8 years to helping tuberculosis victims and performing research on thoracic surgery. In such a short amount of time, Bethune managed to invent and innovate upon 12 medical and surgical instruments, such as the modified rib stripper, the pleural poudrage, and the Bethune rib shears, which was his most famous invention. Many of these are actually still used today. Bethune gradually became tired of surgical treatment and turned towards socioeconomics with regards to disease and medicine. It was then he began to exhibit his then seen as radical socialist views. He was one of the first who brought forth the idea that the state was responsible for public health and urged Canada to implement universal healthcare. In 1936, he founded the Montreal Group for the Security of People's Health, the first socialized medicine group in Canada. He was able to gather sponsorships from medical personnel as well as over 100 workers. They made plans for a provincial healthcare system and cared for the poor, who could not afford medical services. Bethune himself made proposals like compulsory health insurance, care of the unemployed, and a system of municipal medicine. However, the group's beliefs were met with complete indifference, leaving Bethune disillusioned. Norman Bethune was also involved politically in Canada as an advocate for women's rights. In one of his letters he wrote, "Women have been slaves for too long. I am tired of idiots who try to keep explaining the female mind. The female mind is the human mind. Under inhuman conditions it will suffer. The myths created about the so-called female mind are kept alive by men who would like to keep the woman in bondage." Bethune also heavily valued arts education and set up the Children's Art School of Montreal, a free art school, along with the Canadian artists Fritz Brantner and Marion Scott. Later that year, a civil war broke out in Spain. Norman Bethune had, in 1935, previously joined the Communist Party after a visit to the Soviet Union, finding that his own goals of changing the world for the better were reflected in the party. In the war, he helped the Republicans and jumped into action immediately in the front lines. His experience in World War I as a stretcher bearer made him value speed in helping the wounded. His medical efforts and inventions saved thousands upon thousands of lives. Bethune was assigned as the leader of the Canadian medical units and exhibited great leadership and creativity. He was able to supply the entire 1,000-kilometer-long Madrid front line using a quickly constructed blood transfusions organization. With a staff of 25 people, an ambulance, and several blood labs and blood banks, Bethune and his organization collected blood from donors in the city to be transferred to the battlefield. In addition, Bethune created the first mobile medical units, consisting of medicine, bandages, and other supplies that were enough for hundreds of operations. They kept medical workers closer to the front line in order to treat the wounded faster. By the spring of 1937, Bethune and his small medical team gave as many as 100 blood transfusions per day. He returned to Canada later that year as a hero. Despite his fame, his effort to raise money for the anti-fascist cause in Spain was met with very little interest. Just then, he noticed another war taking place around the Pacific. Chinese Chairman Mao Zedong and the Communist Army were trying to resist against fascist Japanese invaders, and Bethune became determined to make a difference. He gathered the Canadian-American Mobile Medical Unit and on January 8, 1938, joined the 8th Route Army in the Shanxi-Hubei border region of China. Here, Bethune rendered up his life for the Chinese and saved countless lives. He continued to improve his medical equipment and came up with new medical inventions and applied them in his work. He grew the size of the blood transfusions and medical units and even led them to the front lines to operate while under heavy gunfire. Even as the Japanese invaders bombed almost all the hospitals and buildings in the region, they managed to continue their support by changing a temple to an operating theater. Bethune operated at an exceptional rate. One time, he operated on 115 people over 69 hours without stopping, even while under heavy artillery fire. Unfortunately, Bethune sealed his fate in October 1939 when he cut his finger in a surgery and contracted septicemia, or blood poison. Due to his weakened state, he died of his wounds on November 12, 1939, shocking the world and the Chinese nation. Throughout his lifetime, Bethune truly defined Canada to be what it is today. His devotion to tuberculosis victims, alongside his extensive research and impressive inventions, which are mostly still important today, showed the world Canada's medical prowess and saved thousands of people as well. Bethune was also one of the first to introduce the idea of universal healthcare in Canada. Although he did not live to see his dream implemented in the system, his proposals, arguments, and legacy contributed later to his acceptance, and now Canada is known, especially in the United States, as one of the great Western countries that triumph under the system. His support of women's rights contributed greatly to the gradual equalization of gender roles in our society today. Additionally, his work in the Spanish Civil War and Second Sino-Japanese War saved thousands of lives and many more in the future, and due to his Canadian identity, Canada was also credited with its great humanitarian causes. Chairman Mao Zedong wrote an essay called In Memory of Bethune, in which he spoke of Bethune's spirit of absolute selflessness. Later, it became mandatory reading in China and appears in every city, in every school, in every classroom. My mom was just telling me how she had to write about him in high school. Dr. Norman Bethune's selfless work as a surgeon, teacher, founder, and administrator of hospitals in China built an eternal bond of extraordinary friendship between the Chinese and Canadian populations. This outstanding, heroic saint of a Canadian gave his life for the Chinese people. His influence could very well be one of the reasons why Chinese people are so keen on immigrating to Canada today. Trade and diplomacy between Canada and China has certainly benefited from Norman's influence. The Canadian federal government formally declared Bethune a Canadian of national historical significance in 1972 and built the Bethune Memorial in his hometown, Gravenhurst, Ontario. Dr. Norman Bethune, a true Canadian, will never forget.